Welcome to today's Forum Hour. This is the fourth in our series for Lent called Walking the Walk. And we're pleased to bring the Reverend Dr. Melody Knowles. She's also the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Associate Professor of Old Testament at Virginia Theological Seminary. We've been really blessed this Lenten season with the faculty, and I hope you've all really enjoyed and gained a lot from these talks. I know I have. Dr. Knowles is a Hebrew scholar, but we'll be talking today about her most recent work, which is on the Psalms. She has a series of publications that are scholarly in nature of her research and investigation of the Psalms. So we're really blessed to be able to hear about that today. After she talks, we will have our traditional Q&A, and we will pass the mic. Please do not turn off the mic at any point. It can be left on so the people at home can hear. And please do not begin asking your question until you have the mic, if you don't mind. That's the only complaint we ever get about Forum Hour. So thank you. Welcome, Dr. Knowles.
I'm tempted to say that that's the only complaint you ever get until now. Okay, since you're all sitting back, I'm going to move the podium. It really is a pleasure to be here with old friends, Frank and the Augustins, and then some new friends, Mitchell's. It's nice to chat with you beforehand. And Amy, thank you. I don't have a watch, so it's 11:45 now. Is that right? 12 o'clock. Okay, so we'll go for about 30 minutes, 45 minutes or so. I have kind of an internal, after teaching for a while, I have this internal clock that tells me when 50 minutes is up. But just send me a panic sign if things are going on too long and your roast is burning in the oven. Okay, so I thought this would be, when Amy asked, actually it wasn't Amy, but someone from this church asked for me to present, I thought that I'm working on a large commentary on the Psalms. And then when you're doing that, you're looking at a blank page and you're thinking, what do I have to do before I can do this thing? And then I thought, I want to dig deep into one single psalm so I can kind of do a book-length treatment on one text. Because in the commentary, you're actually saying no more than you're saying yes, because you've got to edit things out. And then I realized, actually, what I really want to do is obviously delay the larger project, but what I really want to do is just write a really short book on how to read a psalm. I think actually that's harder than it looks, and so that's sort of what this talk emanates out of that work. So as you think about Lent together as a church community and walking the walk, engaging the Spirit in your daily life, I thought it might be interesting to think about praying the Psalms. How do we read the Psalms and pray the Psalms throughout Lent and throughout the whole church year? Now, you as a group, I can guarantee that you all think when I say, I think we should pray the Psalms, you would all say, yes, we should do that. You've been formed as people who attend church, or even not all that regularly, that somehow the Psalms are good. We should engage them. Whenever we gather together and worship, a psalm appears. At funerals, weddings, baptisms, church services, a psalm's always somehow present when Christians worship, and Jews as well. So they're regularly read, so that tells us something. It also tells us something when we think about who reads them. Oftentimes it's the community that reads them. So the gospel is reserved for the priest, and then a single voice usually reads the other lessons, but then either the choir sings them or the whole church community reads them. And so that's sort of telling you something about your ownership of these particular texts. And then oftentimes I'm assuming a lot of Psalms just kind of go past you as you read them through. I mean, you're distracted, but I think at some points, I hope that you've all been arrested at one moment in your life about just some beautiful line or phrase of a Psalm, and you think, oh, that's good. So today's Psalm 130, out of the depths have I called unto you, O Lord. I mean, that's good. Or Psalm 23, what you read last week, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So they're ubiquitous for us as worshiping members. Tradition tells us that they're important, and they're just beautiful. So we respond to them on a visceral level. But all of this hides how actually complicated these texts are. They are not easy texts at all to really sit and read, or even to understand. They're poetry, so already it's not a very straightforward genre. They're ancient poems, which makes it even more complicated, and they're translated poems. So, we've got so much happening there. We're reading these in translation from a community who worshipped much differently than we do now, with different assumptions about how art should work, how poetry should work, and maybe even how prayer should work. So, because it always cracks me. So here's my case study. This is your bulletin from today, right? In the bulletin, where we see them, they look so tidy. nice little box, right? But when we actually start to read them, all of a sudden we realize that, like I said, they're actually kind of complicated, and we don't often we know we're supposed to like them, but we don't oftentimes have the skills in order to understand how to read them properly, or for richness. So where is the narrative line, one oftentimes asks in the psalm? How do all of those verses fit together? What's happening in the text? And then what are we missing in translation? So all of those questions. So if you sometimes feel that they are massively going over your head lots of times, I'm not actually surprised. That's not at all unusual. Because a lot of times there isn't a narrative line. It's not clear why the pieces fit together. I think that they're a lot messier on the insides than they appear on the outside. And then you think, okay, so what were they originally used for? Like I said, they developed out of ancient worship, and oftentimes are associated with King David. But there again, that should give you pause. Like, why should this ancient king, the life of an ancient king, have anything to do with our own contemporary moral or ethical life? And how should the worshiping patterns of an ancient community, how are we related to that? Okay, so there you are. You're stuck in a conundrum. You are shaped to consider these texts as significant, but you're mostly, I'm thinking, I'll speak for you, baffled as to how you should make sense of them. So what I'm just going to do in the next couple of minutes is just to present some principles, we'll call them tips for making sense of these texts. So we all have the conundrum of understanding these texts. I'll just make a confession. I have a conundrum here too. So I'm here, behind this podium, so I have authority, and I'm the expert, right? Except that when you talk about Psalms with people, turns out oftentimes they know a lot as well. So I'm here as the expert, but I really would love to hear from you, and my assumption is that you all have much to teach me and to teach each other in your own experience with these beautiful texts over the years. Okay, but here I am. I'm called to talk, and I will, and maybe I can put some things into a summary that maybe you haven't quite been able to articulate, but I hope that you can also, I hope it's reciprocal, okay? Okay, so a couple questions that I like to ask about Psalms are what, how, and why. Those basic questions that you should ask most anything. The what, so we'll spend a little bit of time with the what. Well, so what is this text doing? Now, oftentimes we don't actually ask that text of the psalm. Sometimes it feels, when I see people read them, or when I quiz my students on what's going on, it feels more like they are reading a Hallmark card, or a variety of Hallmark cards, right? Like here's this card, and this verse is my, or like a Chinese fortune cookie, right? This verse is beautiful, I'm going to live with this verse. And then you go on to the next verse. But it's almost like they're not a coherent narrative, because it's hard to see the coherent narrative. So what is going on? Usually we just say, well, what pious words does verse 2 have for my life today? But I'm trying to get you to, in the whole of the poem, in the whole of the psalm, say, what is going on here? What is the narrative thread? Okay, so in order to dig down into this little question, into this big question, what is going on? So some tools to think about this. Psalms, as poetry, poets never really follow all the rules, right? They're breaking more rules than they're making. But there are a couple of rules of psalms, and that there's two basic types of psalms, two genres. So they're either laments or they're praise. Those are kind of like the two poles. And Psalms move anywhere in between, and sometimes it starts as a lament and ends with praise, or the other way around. I mean, there's lots of variations, but if you can just sort of think, is this more of a lament or more of a praise? That's kind of a basic way into this text. And then, I think it's more of a lament. Okay, and then if it's say you've decided it's more of a lament, then think about what are the major parts. And like any great piece of literature, it'll have a beginning and a middle and an end. So, I mean, so these are all these are all sort of obvious questions, but questions that we aren't always thinking about to apply to a poem like this. So is it a psalm, is it a praise or lament? And then where's the beginning, where's the middle, where's the end? Okay, let's start with praise. So most praise psalms, they begin with sort of a call to praise or a declaration that I will praise the Lord, a call to praise, and then they give the reasons for praise, because God is blah, 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 or God has done blah, blah, blah. So the call or the reason, announcement, the call or the intention to give praise, and then the reasons why we should do this or I should do this, and then at the end, a renewal or a request. So either they say, again, I will praise, or God, will you, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's praise. Now this is what I love about Psalms. Turns out that there's two ways to praise, and I hadn't thought about this before. In the Psalms, we either praise God's, who God is and God's self. We call those hymns. So who God is. God, you are great. You are magnificent. Your name is praised. That's a kind of a hymn praise. And then the other type of praise is thanksgiving. This praise is God's actions. Because you have rescued me, because you've rescued us. So you're giving thanks for something that God has done. And the reason why I like this is because when I think about my own praise of God, like you, in the American context, in the 21st century, I'm much more comfortable talking about who God is rather than what God has done. So just that whole genre of thanksgiving forces me to say things that I'm not all that comfortable with. Like I really can't, I feel inadequate to say, oh, God did that thing, or that thing over there. Because, I don't know, maybe the wind did it. But it makes me think about God's active presence in the world in ways that I'm not used to. When we say, I was talking to a friend whose wife had a baby, and everyone says, congratulations. I'm like, okay, well, I guess so. I mean, that's appropriate. But then, where is God's hand at work in that moment? And where is thanksgiving for God giving to this family a child, for the miracle of life? In order to see God's hand there, thanksgiving sort of pushes me to say more than I'm oftentimes comfortable with, but for which I'm really glad, because it makes me see God's presence in the world. Okay, so hymns for who God is, and thanksgiving for what God has done. Okay, let's look at some. Do you have your Book of Common Prayers? Can you turn to Psalm 95? Right, good, thank you. It's page 724. Can someone please read the first verse?
Let us shout for joy to the rock of our salvation.
Oh, thank you. I forgot about the mic. Thank you. Now remind me of your name. We were talking before. Jackie? Okay. Actually, Jackie, what you did was something actually pretty complicated. I said read the first verse. And what you did was you could have made the decision. This psalm begins with 19th day morning prayer, 95. Venite exultamus. I don't really know Hebrew, but Latin. So that's just to show you that in some ways, I think as complicated as these texts may be, we're actually pretty sophisticated in reading them. And you've already made some significant decisions about where you should begin. But okay, so I've already told you that this is This is a hymn, so it's praising God for who God is. So it begins with a call to praise. So think about the speaker inviting everyone to do this thing called, let us sing to the Lord, let us shout for joy. Where does the invitation to praise end in this text? Excellent. Yeah. So verse 1 and verse 2 are the extended call to praise. Let us sing, let us shout, let us come, let us raise a loud shout. Good. So if you haven't heard the call to praise by the end of verse 2, then you have to put your hearing helper on. You should have gotten, because it repeated it 4 times. Okay. And then so then we get to the middle section, the rationale, the reason for the kind of praise that begins in verse 3. And that's you can see that because they have the word for. Now, it's a different word in Hebrew, obviously, but oftentimes it's translated as for or because in the English. And so this is totally corny, but whenever you see a for in the Psalms, think about what it's there for. Okay, so what it's there for is to say, why should we praise? So you all praise, and then you say, well, but what? Why? And then because the Lord is great, a great God, great King. In his hands are the caverns of the earth. Like just on and on and on about why should we praise this God? And then you're given a justification, a rationale. 3 verses for that. Good. And then notice that verse 6, again, poets are breaking the rules, right? Verse 6 starts again with another call to praise. Come, let us bow down and kneel before the... Why? For the Lord is our God, and we are the people of his pasture. Now, 95. So this is a very typical psalm that you begin your day with, and it usually ends right about 7 because 8, 9, and 10 and 11 take a kind of a surprising turn. This praise is motivating something else. Who's speaking in verses 8, 9, 10, 11? God. Okay, good. We oftentimes think of Psalms as the words of David or maybe the words of the congregation, but sometimes God shows up. Now, I grew up in a tradition where we had New Testament and we had red letter editions. You guys know those? Where Jesus talks, right? So in the red. So I to make my fortune, I'd love to do a red letter edition of the Bible. And if we did, of the whole Bible, and if we did for the Psalms, so verses 8, 9, 10, and 11 would appear in a red print. This is God showing up in the Psalms and talking directly to us. Okay, but the beginning, 95, 1 through 7, is sort of a typical praise, typical hymn, and then we realize it's getting set up to do something a little different in the end. Okay, but let's go to a typical Thanksgiving now. Psalm 30. Page 621, right. So remember, 2 types of praise. Hymns for who God is. You are a great God, a great King above all gods. Thanksgiving for what God has done. So it begins typically with an intention to praise or a call to praise. And where does the middle section begin in Psalm 30? Verse 2. Okay, good, because it's tricky. It actually kind of goes in and out of the beginning section, the middle section. So, I will exalt you, intention to praise. Why? Because you've lifted me up, right? So we go for the motivation, the rationale. And then, I cried out to you, and you restored me to health. So we get the sort of the rationale right in the middle of verse 1. These are all the reasons I should praise you, God. You lifted me up, not let my enemies triumph. You restored me to health. You brought me up. You restored me. And then 4 opens it up again. Because of this testimony, I'm going to almost begin to say, text again, sing to the Lord, you servants of his. Why? Because his wrath endures but the twinkling of an eye. So you see it kind of goes back and forth with the call to praise and then the rationale for praise. And then it ends with a request. Where's the request? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Priest versus priest. Let's go. How about 10? Okay, so.
Starts to argue with God a little bit, but I could be wrong about that.
Good. So the setup is.
What profit is there in my blood if I go down to
Yeah.
the pit?
Yeah.
Is
So
he still praising?
yeah. Well, so that's a conversation extending from verse 7, right? When this happened in the past. Well, God saved me in the past, but then this also happened in the past. I said, I shall never be disturbed. And you made me strong. But then you hid your face, right? I cried to you and I said, if I die, you're down a member of the choir. Right? Like, don't. So there's you see a lot to see in the Psalms. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about how and why. But the why of this is there's a certain sense of which the psalmist is giving reasons for God to do the thing that the psalmist wants God to do. So save me. Why? Because if you don't, you won't have as many people to praise you. But ask your question again, Susan. Ask your question again, or your point. Say your point again.
Well, I was saying the shift felt to me like there in the prophet. What profit is there in my blood if I go down to the pit? It's a shift, but I think you're right. Up at 8, it says, then you hid your face, and I was filled with fear. So that's maybe where the shift, it feels like a shift, right?
Yeah.
From praise into, but wait a minute, and that's where I would,
Good.
there's a shift of some sort.
Yes. Okay, so just as they can talk about the past when God saved, they can talk about the past when it didn't feel like God was about to save.
Right.
But then Thanksgivings usually end with an announcement that God has saved, and therefore the rest of the congregation should praise. You have turned my wailing into dancing. Therefore my heart sings. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so those are the two types of praise. We can't spend very much time there because it's Lent. So we're going to spend more time with lament. Okay, that's for post-Easter. Okay, so let's move to laments. So laments, like praise, beginning, middle, and end. The beginning is usually some kind of an address to God. And then they spend a lot of time talking about what's the problem. And then laments usually end actually looking a lot like a praise. That's the weird thing about laments. Okay, let's look at some. Let's look at one that we'll read on Good Friday, Psalm 22. It's a long, long psalm, but one of the more gorgeous ones. Okay, so the address is, my God, my God. And then we head right into the lament. Now, just as there's two types of ways to praise, there's 3 different things that you can complain about in the lament. Well, we can get really creative with all those 3. But the standard ones are, there's what we call an I lament, like the problem is me. They lament, the problem is all those people out there that are making my life difficult. And the third is the you lament. And God, you actually are my biggest problem today. And Psalm 22 plays with all of these 3, but begins with the you lament. Why have you forsaken me? You're so far from my cry. I cried, but you don't answer, and by day and night, and find no rest. Okay, so most of those first 2 verses are what we call a you lament. God is making the psalmist's life horrible.
This is the first evening prayer. Is lament always in the evening?
That's okay. So in the Book of Common Prayer, right, we've divided the Psalter up into 30 days, so you can go through the Psalter if you want to on your own. This happens to be in the evening. I think that's random.
Okay.
Because you have to have the way that they shaped this was just so they can have whatever. You're going to pray the Psalms for 8 minutes a day, divided the Psalter. Okay. But it does feel very much like an evening prayer. Or maybe it's too depressing to be an evening prayer, but okay.
It was a rough day.
It was a really rough day. Okay, good. So it begins with the You Lament. Notice, okay, and then we la la la, and then we also get to where do we turn? Oh, so actually, let's just stay with the different types of Yous. Well, no, let's move with the how the psalm moves forward. Knowing that it's going to start with a You Lament, think about the power of the beginning. So it's not just Dear God or Oh Lord, but it's my God, you're my greatest problem. And then it goes to, in verse 2, oh my God, I cried. Again, you are still my problem. What's the power of both the repetition and also the use of the possessive suffix there? For me, it just sort of heightens the pathos, right? It's not just anyone's God, but it's my God, and my God is the one that's giving me the sorrow. And the repetition makes it even worse. So very short introduction, especially compared to other laments, but it really packs a punch. And then again, the contrast is, okay, I cry, you don't answer by day and night. And then that verse 3, yet you are the Holy One, enthroned on the praises of Israel, our forefather. So there's another contrast, right? You should be my God, but it doesn't feel like it. In the past, you acted more like the God that I would recognize, but that's not what I'm getting in the present. So the clash between expectations, both the past and the present, and both who a God should be and who God isn't currently being. Okay, I hope you all had breakfast, because this is a pretty hard stuff. Okay, and then it gets even worse. So in verse 6, I am a worm and no man. All who see me laugh me to. So there's this, I am a worm and no man. That's a sense of the I lament, right? The problem is me. In my own identity, I'm not who I wish to be or want to be or should be. And then we get into the they laments. All who see me laugh me to scorn. They curl their lips and wag their heads. And then again, in verse 9, this shouldn't be happening. Because this is the kind of God who you were in my past and the one that I would expect you to be.
He's really disappointed.
It's a very bad day for the psalmist, yeah. Yeah. And so, okay, so the address, the you lament, the what one should have expected, and then the I lament, and then the they lament. And then in verse 11, the request. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. So there's such amazing contrast in this text, because who is close to the psalmist? There's a sense in which it's like he's bound in by all of the theys. They're really present, right? But what he's missing, or she's missing, is the you. So the crowd is very present, but God is very absent. And the other contrast is, if God's not present, why is this prayer being made? I mean, that's the irony of it all. There's some, even in the harshest of words, the harshest complaint to God, the fact that they're being addressed to God, there's a sense of a statement of faith there. Somehow, these words should work. Okay, and then we get into 12, we get the crowds again, everyone else there, and then the I lament, I'm poured out like water, verse 14 and 15 as well. Okay. Then, like I said, all of the laments, well, most of them, we expect them to take a turn. At some point, there's the technical term is this, change of mood. It just cracks me up, because I mean, that's exactly what happens. Usually, I lament, you lament, they lament, request. And sometimes you go through that again and again because it kind of doesn't trigger something. It just like spiral through these sections again. And then the end of the lament, usually there's a lightening. Where do you see that in Psalm 22?
Verse 22.
Okay, good. Well, 18 is still the request. You are my strength. Hasten to help me. Save me. Save me.
21.
Yeah. Now notice that the editors here, that space between 21 and 22 doesn't occur in the original text. They're trying to guide you into saying something's different. Something's happened between those two verses. I think actually you're more correct to say something happened between verses, in the middle of verse 21. Depending on how you translate the verbs, it could be you saved me from the lion's mouth. So anyway, somewhere between, let's go with the editors of the Book of Common Prayer and say that the change happens between 21 and 22. Now, if you just started with verse 22, what would it sound like? What kind of a psalm would it sound like? Praise, right? Praise, invitation to praise. Why should we praise? Because he doesn't despise nor abhor the poor in their poverty, right? This is a standard praise psalm that is all of a sudden breaks into the darkest, deepest lament. So this is actually standard to the form of laments. There's some that don't have this model. Psalm 88 is the most famous, but there's other ones. But generally, it ends with this kind of joy, praise, which actually, when you think about it, is a lot like life, right? I told you that there's two poles, there's praise and lament, and that the poets mess with those poles. But I noticed that that actually reflects me as well, my heart. So I'll have something wonderful happen, and my immediate thought is, how long will this last? Or something horrible will happen, and I'll think, oh, I remembered something different. You're at a funeral, and you remember, you're laughing because of the nice memories. So for me, this just to me mirrors how I experience these deep emotions too. Sometimes you're just full blown into the heat of it, but oftentimes in lament, you remember a time of joy, or in a time of joy, you worry about your next lament. But okay, so in the form of lament, we oftentimes get praise at the end. So what happened? What is that space in between those two verses? That in my book, there's nothing going on, right? It's just pure blank space. What happened in that blank space? What motivates the change? And there's no right answer here, okay, so I'm not actually setting you up, but what motivates that? What could you put into that space between those verses? There's a shift in the
who the speaker is talking.
A different speaker
who the speaker
comes
is
in.
talking to. Yeah.
That's really great. So we're going to talk a little bit about voicing too, because who is speaking, and sometimes we could make the mistake that it's just a single person speaking all the way through, but maybe like we saw in Psalm 95, maybe some other speaker will show up. So I emote all of my lament, and my priest says to me, it's going to be okay. Right?
These are all songs.
They're songs, yeah.
And it could be that up until 21, it's a solo, and starting in 22, the chorus comes in.
Oh, I love that. That's great.
There's the chorus.
Yeah, it took
Member
you a
of the
while
choir,
to get to that chord, let me just say. But then you do, and all of a sudden it becomes. But how does that work though? How is that coherent? Okay. Oh, we're gonna wait because I know you're gonna say something profound, so we have to give you a mic.
What strikes me with 20 and 21 is that he's bargaining with God. If you save me, then I will ask my brethren to praise you.
I like that. There's a way in which, just like the other psalm motivated God by saying, if you kill me, you won't have as many people to praise you. This could also kind of be a motivation to say, look, I need my situation to change, and kind of as a show of faith, I will speak the words that you're used to your congregation hearing. So I want this to be this way, or fundamentally I am this way, and I'm still faithful, right?
But I kind of don't like that.
You don't like it? Why not?
No, that he's bargaining with God. Only if you save me will I, I don't like that.
Yeah, see, there's so much in the Psalms not to like. I'm with you. We don't, like I said, the very form of Thanksgiving always challenges me. This kind of conversational mode, or this relationship that's being modeled here, sometimes I wonder about too. But then I think, then what is the power of intercessory prayer? Like, why bother at all? Like, if it's nothing that we say is ever going to move God, then why bother? So then I think, okay, so somehow, in ways that I don't understand, God actually is in a relationship with us. And what that part of a relationship means, I hope, is that there's a mutuality. And all my theology comes into play there. And I don't, it's not like I'm never the king of the universe, but God, it's somehow what I say matters to God. And I'm really struck by that too. Is that part of the space? What happens between 21 and 22? Could you, with the microphone in your hand, would you like to say more about that?
And I'm sorry, I'm an interloper, but couldn't resist, Dr. Knowles. Thank you. I wonder if my friend over there is right, that there is this bargain, right? This, if you save me, I will declare your name. Is there not a space, not only for breath, right? Because when we lament, it's just pouring out. And we got to breathe. Is there not a space for the Spirit to breathe in as well?
Yeah.
And maybe 22 begins a response from the psalmist to that Spirit that breathes into the lament.
Great. So it's something actually has changed. Perspective, a sense of perspective, maybe a catharsis. I said all those things, and now that has helped me get to a new realization. All of these things are possible. So it could be like something actually external happened. A priest came in, a different speaker emerged, the choir, something externally is different. It could actually be that we read them in one sitting, but maybe actually it wasn't in one sitting. That is, 1 through 21 was yesterday. And then that external thing happened, and now 22 through the end is today. So those are external. Or it could be internal, right? I voiced everything that I could. I gave all my I, you, and me laments that I had. And then now I have a sense of perspective, a sense of cleansing. What did you say? The Spirit might have moved, right? I have a better sense of perspective. Now I can see truly. So it's something internal to me as well. So what explains that space? All of these are options for that change of mood. Good. There's some, that's fine. So this is the what is a psalm doing? It's either praising or lamenting. You got the various parts of the types, the various parts of what that means to praise or lament, the various ways that we can praise, the various things that we can lament about. So those are kind of your basic building blocks of how to read a psalm. Okay, so what is it doing? And now how is it doing? And how am I doing? What's the time?
It's about 25
Oh, okay. Okay, we'll move this right along. So how's it doing? through poetry. And you will say to me, great, because it's in translation, right? As it happens, I mean, there's great things you can see when you read it not in translation, but the building blocks of Hebrew poetry are actually things that are translatable. The repetition of words, we can get that in English. And then also you'll notice that most verses have two parts. So there's a parallelism. So the second part is saying something usually similar to the first, but not the same. So how do those two parts of the verse how do they cohere together? What's the second part saying that the first one didn't say? That's kind of the trick of thinking about these psalms and the way the verses work. And then voicing. Who's saying what and to whom? Let's go back to Psalm 130 that you read today. So I'm going to go, you can read in your book or in your bulletin. So that, I mean, it would be nice if our Hebrew Bibles came with, so if it's a script, who's reading the script? But it doesn't. Oh, maybe it's good that it doesn't, because then we get to use our imagination. So out of the depths, this kind of doesn't fit easily into either a lament or a praise, but there is a request being made of God. Okay, so so we're thinking about voicing here, and then we'll look a little bit about repetition. So obviously it's the speaker praying to God. I have called you, O Lord. If you were to know what is done amiss, who could stand? This is another kind of, not quite bargaining, but a kind of God, you can't punish everyone justly, because then we're all toast. So consider the voice of my supplication, knowing that I'm just a frail human being. So I'm frail, but also I know who you are. You are a God who forgives. So the verses 1 through 3, the speaker's speaking to God. And who's the speaker speaking to in verse 4 and 5? The community. Definitely in 6, O Israel, wait for the Lord, right? In 4 and 5, it might be interior or to the community. But just notice that, because we always think about prayers as spoken to God, but there's a lot of speaking to the community in Psalms as well. Although sometimes our prayers are like this too. I mean, Susan, I know you don't, or Frank, I know you don't lead prayers something like this, where I call them like announcement prayers, like, or the one time when I went to early church on a day, and I had read the newspaper before, but in the prayers for the dead, they named Princess Diana, and clearly half the congregation didn't know, and everyone's like, so, prayers that teach or announce things. So sometimes you think, who's that prayer to? Is it to the community? Like, God, we know that that we will work so hard this Lent to deny our sins or whatever. So teaching prayers or announcement prayers, where you sometimes feel that they're more to the gathered community than they actually are to God. There's something like that with the Psalms too. So the first couple verses are to God, and then 4 and 5, either to the person themselves, this is what I will do. And then 6 and 7 to the entire, literally to the entire community, although maybe 4 and 5 is that way too. Okay, so that's another way to think about what's the voicing and who's speaking to whom. To think about that when you read a psalm. The last thing I want to do is think about the repetition. There's a lot of repetition in poetry, in Hebrew poetry. And that's oftentimes why I think it feels redundant or boring. What's the narrative thread? I can't find it. And by the way, they keep saying the same thing again and again. In this text, there's one particular word that gets repeated. Wait, exactly. Now notice this is not in the address to God, but it's the address to the self or to the community. I wait, my soul waits, my soul waits. I'm doing these things 3 times. And now I'm going to turn and ask my community to do that too. Oh, Israel, wait. What's the force of that repetition? I mean, the guy could have used a thesaurus and looked up a synonym for wait. But as you read it, You read it this morning. You read it now. I wait. My soul waits. My soul waits. O Israel, wait. How is that working for you?
Well, I know when I repeat something in a sermon, that it's like, notice this.
Emphasis.
This is an emphasis, right,
Yeah.
on what it's, but there's also a power in it. I think you used the word earlier, and I'm struggling to find the word again, but it, I don't know, it kind of stirs something inside of me, rather than just, it's not just the repetition and the emphasis, there's something about, get this
Get
at
this.
a deep level.
And it's a call to action, too.
And it could be
It's a call to action.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just,
Yeah.
yeah, you get to think, oh, okay, what does waiting mean, right? What are all the different ways that one word could mean? Wait, it could just mean be still, but then it could be, actually, it's more than that.
Well, to me, this call for waiting is that there will be an outcome. There is the faith that there is going to be an outcome from this waiting.
Good.
I have another musical
Excellent.
allusion.
Love it.
It's the repetition. I think you could think of as a crescendo,
Oh, good.
because the first wait is a quiet, personal wait, and then there's the elaboration that with the verse 7, my soul waits, and then everybody, Israel, and then it's not wait but hope. That is addressed to and then the final, the loudest is he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities.
Beautiful.
And I had another sort of a technical question, because I have the Hebrew. I lived in Israel for a number of years, and I learned Hebrew, so I always look at the Hebrew. And each psalm has a little sort of procedural note at the beginning in the Hebrew version that's not printed in our prayer book. And this one is called a song of ascents, which sounds a lot like a processional to me. So if you think of it, it's a processional, and there's a crescendo, and it's leading up to he will redeem Israel. You know, it seems to hang together.
If you read another, if you read a psalm in another version, either your NRSV, another biblical version, oftentimes you'll have what we call a superscription. It was part of the ancient text, and in the Hebrew, it's considered the first verse. And this is a Psalm of David written while he was fleeing from his son, blah, blah, blah. That's considered the first verse. It's edited out of our Book of Common Prayers because they probably are secondary. But what kills me is that got edited out. But the Latin title is there. So I don't know. Okay. But could it be a crescendo? Could it be a crescendo? Yes. So sometimes I use in class I take the lyrics from James Brown's piece, Please, Please. And you don't make me sing it. But that's for me the example of what aren't we getting when we're just reading these texts, right? They could have been musical texts, some of them, and they could have had crescendos and repetitions all over the place. What aren't we seeing? So your imagination, musical or otherwise, can be fully in play when we look at these texts. Okay, I need to draw this all to a close. Okay. Well, so what is the psalm doing? Praising or lamenting? How is it doing? Through poetry, features of parallelism, maybe repetition, voicing. And then the last question, which I'm going to really leave for you, is why is the psalm doing this? Now, we uncovered some of this as we were thinking about maybe the lament in Psalm 22 is catharsis, maybe. We covered some of it when we thought, well, what is it doing to God or for God? Right? Is it justifying, motivating God? Those kinds of things. Is it moving God to act? Look at 130, right? At the end, there's a message for the whole community. Wait for the Lord. With him there is plenteous redemption. If you look at that from God's point of view, you've got a faithful crowd who knows that you will act. If I was God, I would be moved to act if I had that kind of prayer. Pray to me. Let me just say, but who knows what God's thinking? Yeah, I'm going to draw this to a close, but I hope that next time you take out your Psalter or you see these tiny little text box in your bulletins, that you spend a little time asking those types of questions. What, how, and then ultimately, what's the purpose of the text? What is this text aiming to do? Okay, great, thanks. I had a great time with you all.
Thank you so much.
Happy Lent.
You know, we usually take a couple of minutes for questions,
Oh, okay,
but
sure.
I know we're running late. So I'm going to ask mine first.
Okay.
And we will keep it
Feel
short.
free to leave as you wish. I know you all
Yes,
have
and you
roast
can
in
leave
the oven.
if you wish. But I wanted to, one of my problems with reading the Psalms is when you get to the part where it smashes baby against the rocks.
Oh, good.
Right?
Yeah, okay.
And so when I'm thinking of, is this a praise or lament?
Yeah.
And I don't know. And I'm not, and I was flipping through trying to find the Psalm. Which
137.
is it 137?
Yeah.
And I have to tell you, I can't decide as I'm sitting here with you listening.
Well, I think it's definitely lament.
Do you think so?
Yeah.
Page 792.
So we wish that we were someplace else.
Okay.
And we are actually making life harder on ourselves because we're going to remember what that other, when I remembered you, O Zion, right?
Right. Happy show. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and then there's a vow that they shall never forget. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. If I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Jerusalem will always be the place where I want to be, but I'm not there now.
Yeah. Okay. All
And
right.
then 137. This is another place where I wish the Bible would have edited out.
Yes.
Where I feel I need to learn something about this. But so this is what we call like a malediction, a cursing psalm. Happy shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. So it's a curse.
It is a curse, yeah.
And this is actually not the only curse in the Bible, in the Psalter.
No.
We get lots of harsh, hard language. Yeah, there's no praise at the end. There's no change of mood. I wish that there were.
I just seem so happy about it, I guess, is why I...
Weren't they the slaves under Babylon there?
Yes. Yeah, they were.
This is a revolt.
Yes, they do. Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. I've just struggled with it, so.
I mean, it's horrible. It's a hard text. But this text reminds me that there's a way in which I will never understand Psalter. If you read it from a place of privilege, of a place of comfort, the only thing that 137 can do is remind me how real lament is and despair. And those words of 22 that like I can just kind of be almost like a tourist with. For some, those are actual, they're autobiographical. And so it reminds me to kind of, just like when I'm happy and I have to read a lament in church, or I am in sorrow and have to read a praise in church, it expands my imagination and it reminds me that I'm not the center of this community, that I'm speaking with and for the words of others. And texts like 137 remind me of that too.
Well, thank you so
It's a pleasure. It really is a pleasure to be here.
And I just want to tell you that Father Randy says he apologizes for not being here, so.
Okay. All right. We'll see you on the other side of Easter. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mitchell.